Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I will be talking about the best adult fantasy books for beginners. I'm going to be talking about 10 books/fantasy series that are adult and that I feel like would be pretty good for beginners or for people who haven't really read that much fantasy or if they haven't read any fantasy. So I think these are good starting points for people who haven't really read that much fantasy. So for each of these 10 fantasy books/series, I'm going to go into a little bit about what they're about, but mainly I want to go into why I think they would be good for beginners. And for my number 10 spot at the very end of the video, it might be a little bit controversial saying that it would be good for beginners, but hear me out, I've got my reasons. And I think for the first 9, I think people will agree with me. So hopefully if you're a beginner to fantasy, you will watch this video and find some good fantasy books to try out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I'm not really going in any particular order, like from easiest to hardest. It's just kind of random. But for these first 2 books/series, I actually don't own them physically, but I know that they're great audiobooks. So I'm going to suggest them at the front of the video so I don't forget about them. So the first series I'm going to mention is the Dresden Files, and the first book being Stormfront in the Dresden Files series. The Dresden Files is all about a character named Harry Dresden, who the whole story is told through his first-person perspective, and he's essentially a wizard who's also a private investigator. And that's essentially all you need to know going into it. Just know that it's about Harry Dresden, who is a wizard, and he also lives in Chicago, and that's another reason why this series is great for beginners, because a lot of the times you can jump into a fantasy series and you got to remember all these weird names of places and all of the stuff that's going on, but Dresden Files just takes place in Chicago, which is just a city in real life, so not really much you gotta memorize for this series other than a few characters. And like I said, it's definitely a lot easier to jump into a series that's only told through one perspective. And you're getting the whole series through Harry Dresden's eyes. And he's a really great character. And of course, I highly recommend the audio narrated by James Marsters. He basically is Dresden. He's the voice of Dresden, and he does a very great job. So I would highly recommend checking out Stormfront. The other fantasy series that I have to talk about is actually a duology, and that would be the Kingmaker, Kingbreaker duology, with the first book being Innocent Mage and the second book being The Awakened Mage. Now this one is like a more of a classic fantasy where, you know, you've got a different setting other than Earth, and you're following this character who's kind of just like the son of a fisherman, and he kind of just gets entangled into this mess that he doesn't really want to get into, and he starts, you know, doing stuff in this, fantasy setting. So it's more of a classic fantasy feel, but with a bit of a modern touch to it. And again, why I would recommend this as a beginner is because it's told through one perspective. You get the whole story told through the eyes of Asher, who again is the son of a fisherman. Was the son of a fisherman, But basically, he kind of gets entangled into being a stableman for the royal house, and then he kind of like moves up the ladder, and a lot of just classic fantasy stuff going on with this book. And the other thing that makes this appealing to beginners is that it's a duology, because sometimes you can get roped into like this huge fantasy series with like 10 or 12 or even more books, and you're just like, oh man, this is going to take forever. But with this one, it's just a duology. It's 2 books. I really enjoyed it. And also the audiobook is narrated by Kirby Hayborn, one of my all-time favorite audiobook narrators. So I would highly recommend this for fantasy beginners. All right, so the rest of the books / series that I have to talk about in this video, I own physically, which I have right here. Can't see them, or you can see the first book. Yeah. Anyway, I can't really do this type of video without talking about Brandon Sanderson. And one of his books that I would recommend for beginners is Elantris. And this is actually his very first published novel. I know a lot of people don't like this, but I consider this to be one of his most underrated books. And I know a lot of people want to jump into Brandon Sanderson, and they want to jump into some of his more popular stuff like Mistborn and Stormlight Archive. But honestly, I don't know if those are great places to start because those are a bit more complex than his standalones such as Elantris and Warbreaker. You can jump into Elantris. It's very easy to read. There's not really too much intimidating about this book. The previous two books in series that I talked about, they follow one character, but for this one, you do follow three, but it is a lot easier to keep track of than a lot of fantasy series because this one, it follows a pattern. Like you follow POV number 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So the whole time you're reading it, you know whose head you're going to jump into. They're even spelled out on the back for you. Boom. So yes, it's definitely one of Brandon Sanderson's more simple tales. It essentially takes place in Elantris, the city of Elantris. You're following 3 characters, and the magic is very cool. I think this is one of his most underrated books. I love this. I know a lot of people don't, but even if you don't end up loving it, it's still a great place to start because you're only going to go up with Sanderson, right? Because I know a lot of people love Mistborn and Stormlight Archive, but trust me, Stormlight Archive is not really the best place to start with Sanderson. But yeah, I would highly recommend starting with Elantris if you want to jump into a little Brando Sando. Another good place for beginners to start would be the Poppy War trilogy. And this is the first book in the trilogy. And of course, this is about Ren, and this is sort of like a fantasy spin on like historical China. I think it's supposed to be like the 1800s, but it definitely has a lot of historical ties to real life China and real life events. And Ren is definitely one of my all-time favorite protagonists. And the reason why I think this would be a good place to start for beginners is that you do get the whole series, or maybe like 95% of the series, through Ren's eyes. And when it starts out, it definitely has a bit more of like a YA feel. So if you are used to reading like young adult books, like this will probably be more up your alley, like prose and writing style wise. I would say though, however, if you're a bit squeamish and you're not used to like very dark stuff in books, the second half of this book is much darker than the first half. So do be prepared for stuff to get like pretty dark in this book. So I do think this is a great place for beginners because you're following one character and you can kind of just get sucked into her story and her character and just go along with the ride. And I really do think it's a very engaging and very fun fantasy book. So, and it's just a trilogy. So again, not really like a super long series. It's 3 books. If you like the first book, go read the next 2. So yeah, I do think Poppy War is a good place for beginners. Speaking of trilogies, I also recommend to beginners Foundryside. Now, Robert Jackson Bennett has written some horror books, and he's also written the City of Stairs trilogy, the Defined Cities trilogy. I wouldn't recommend that one for beginners, but I would recommend this one for beginners because it reads a lot like Brandon Sanderson. A lot of people even say that it's almost a Brandon Sanderson just copy or like he plagiarized. I wouldn't go that far, but he does read very similar to Brandon Sanderson. And this book is definitely very easy to get into. It's basically about this girl named Sanchia, and there's a really cool magic system, just like Brandon Sanderson. This one deals with scribing, which basically you can take an object and change like its mind about like what it's supposed to actually be doing. So it's very cool, very interesting magic system, very fun and witty characters, and the plot is definitely very propelling. So I think this is a very easy book to get into, even for beginners. And speaking of trilogies, again, we have one more to talk about. Even though I haven't finished the whole series, I can at least recommend the first book, and that would be Jade City. Now, this book is on the list, even though it could be troubling for some beginners to like keep track of all of the different clans and the different houses and the different characters that are in this book, because it's very much related to like Godfather and like mafia type stories, where you've got all these different mafias and characters just, dealing with each other. So it is a lot of characters to back and forth, but I do think it's good for beginners because it doesn't necessarily take place in like a really fantastical world. Like it pretty much feels like our world, but like with a tiny bit of Jade magic. And I think it's easier to follow stories that are like set in real world or settings that don't really feel super fantastical, like something like the Stormlight Archive. There's just so much fantastical stuff happening. But with this one, it's very easy to keep track of like where you are, and you don't really have to memorize that much stuff. The main thing for beginners is just to keep track of all the characters. But the characters are great, and the story is great. So I do think beginners would have a good time with Jade City, and I'm very excited to continue with the series. This next book is honestly one of my all-time favorite books, not even just fantasy, and I do think it would be a really fun place to start for beginners, and that would be Kings of the Wild. Now, this book, the concept and the premise is very simple. You've got this old group of guys who were in a mercenary band who, they're kind of long past their prime, but one of them goes to the main character, Clay Cooper, and basically says like, oh, we have to go save my daughter. We have to go on this long journey to save my daughter. And of course they agree. And basically the premise is they go do that, and they get the gang back, they get the band back together, and they go try to save their daughter, or his daughter. And it's really good. It's really fun, and it's very easy to keep track of. And by introducing all the characters slowly, you don't really have to keep track of too much stuff. So I really do think this is a very easy book for beginners. It's also a very fun book, and like I said, it's also just one of my all-time favorite books, because not only do you get a lot of like really fun action, you also get a lot of laughs in this book. So it's not something you have to like really think about too much. It's just a fun book. This next book I saved a little bit towards the end, just because while it is easy to get into, it is 6 books and there are a lot of characters to keep track of, but I do think it would still work for beginners, and that would be Age of Myth. And the main reason why I think it's great for beginners is that it does introduce the reader to a lot of conventional fantasy tropes and just typical fantasy things that you would find in like older classic fantasy books. But Michael J. Sullivan like takes those and kind of makes his own like vision with it. He kind of puts his own spin on everything and kind of modernizes it. So I do think like Lord of the Rings, I do sometimes see people put Lord of the Rings on beginners list, And I highly disagree with that because the writing style just does not work for a lot of people. So it's harder, even though the story and the characters are great, like just the writing style itself doesn't lean towards a easy reading experience. But for this one, you get very similar vibes with all of the classic fantasy, but in a modern writing style and modern writing conventions. So I do think this one would definitely be appealing to a lot of people, beginners who want to get more or want to read fantasy. And I think this one would work out very well. Very fun story, very fun characters, easy to follow. It is 6 books though, so it is a little bit more of a commitment than some of these other ones. But I do think people would get a huge kick out of Age of Myth. This next one I also put towards the end of the video because it's not necessarily as easy as some of the other ones, but I do think it's a good stepping stone for, like, maybe if you've read a couple of these, you could step into this one and it would still be pretty easy to get through. And that would be The Bone Shard Daughter. So I don't necessarily think this is a hard book because of the writing style or just the book length in general. Like, it's a short book, it's only going to be a trilogy. The main reason why I think it is difficult is because not only are you getting introduced to all of these fantastical elements that are sometimes unconventional, because like the magic system in here deals with bone shard, like using bones for magic, which you don't normally see in fantasy. And then also there's just a lot of mystery elements and just unknown stuff. So the reader is trying to piece together all of this stuff and figure out what exactly is going on. You've got a character who has amnesia. She doesn't even really know who she is. So there's a lot of stuff to try to figure out and puzzle out as a reader while trying to keep track of all the characters and all of the settings. And also, you know, a little bit more of an unconventional fantasy setting because you've got like this group of islands to keep track of. So it's not necessarily the easiest book to jump into, but I do think the writing style and the way that Andrea Stewart writes the book is definitely appealing to a more modern fantasy audience. Like, you're not going to get bombarded with all kind of crazy technical language or flowery prose. Like, you're going to get a straightforward story. You're just going to have to pay more attention than maybe some of the other books. But I do think the journey is definitely worth it. Stick it out to the end, and it's definitely one of my all-time favorite fantasy debuts. Now, for the last fantasy series I have to talk about, people are probably going to disagree with me, but I do have my reasoning for it. I definitely don't think people should start with this book, but it is a decent idea giving one thing in mind. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to go with A Song of Ice and Fire, the first book, A Game of Thrones. So I do think if you have watched the show, like especially if you're like a faithful fan and you love the show and you've seen all the episodes, I think this would actually be a perfectly good book to jump into, because a lot of the times when you jump into a fantasy series, you're jumping in completely blind. You don't really know the setting, you don't really know the characters, you're trying to figure out what is going on. But if you've seen the show, like, you know the setting, you know the characters, you know basically what's going to happen. So if you jump into book 1, there's not really going to be a lot of surprises. There's not really going to be that much changes. Like, the books change as the further you get into the series, but essentially book 1 is extremely similar to season 1. So you could jump into this book as a show fan and not really have too much of a difficult time with it. So I would say that if you're a show watcher and you've seen Game of Thrones, I would recommend this as a beginner. But if you haven't seen the show and you have no idea what this is about, definitely do not start with this book. All right, so that is my list of adult fantasy books for beginners. Some adult fantasy books and series that I do think would be good for people who haven't really read that much fantasy, or if they haven't read any fantasy at all. I think you could jump into most of these books and have a great time and hopefully get sucked down the rabbit hole of fantasy like a lot of booktubers and fantasy readers have in the past. Please let me know what you think of my list, whether or not you agree or disagree with me, and also leave down some recommendations that I didn't mention in this video, because I know there's probably way more that people would recommend. And for anyone who's watching this video, go check out the comments and get some more recommendations from my lovely audience. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookish Drummer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. I also have my Amazon wish list if anyone would like to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching and have a fantastic day.